Welcome to Topics in Planting Design, Session 1. This presentation is the first of a series intended to explore planting design principles, techniques, and issues. The inspiration for this series are the two highly recognized planting design approaches, one predominantly traditional and the other more natural ecological, located within minutes of our Irvine office. Irvine Company's Villages of Irvine and 5 Points Great Park neighborhoods each offer good examples of the two approaches, which I like to call paradigms. Today's objectives are: explore the traditional and natural ecological paradigms by identifying distinct planting design models. Review the functional locational terms used to describe plant roles within each planting design model. Review local examples to see if we recognize the planting design models and evaluate if the proposed categorizations are valid. Planting design is essentially all about selecting and combining plants in a composition with some kind of big idea. The first image and the accompanying diagram show a traditional layered planting design. It uses horizontal layers, each containing one plant species. It is organized, easy to understand, and attractive. Its big idea is to be visually pleasing. It's more traditional in its design approach. The second image is a coastal sage scrub hillside and a diagram that shows many overlapping plant symbols and hatches. The diagram mimics how plants grow in nature. One can imagine using a diagram such as this to design a natural landscape as shown in the photo. Its big idea would be to be self-sustaining and habitat-supporting. This one is a more natural, ecological design approach. Next, we'll make a quick review of the origins of the traditional approach and how it has been adapted to more naturalistic styles. Then, drawing on the academic work of two main sources, we will take a look at several planting design models in current practice, ranging from the more traditional to the more natural ecological. The traditional paradigm, gotta change the slide here. The traditional paradigm is by definition rooted in traditional historic garden design. Here is a brief history reminder, represented in famous French, Italian, Spanish, and Persian historic gardens. They illustrate the visual control of the land, taming and domestication of plants, the sequencing of spaces, and the importance of water, views, and other focal elements. The traditional forms in England metaphorically escaped the palace grounds and evolved in the countryside into an informal pastoral model. The English pastoral model was brought to America, inspired by its vast natural and wild landscapes, and converted to the public park, the naturalistic landscape for recreation, relaxation, and respite. Although the examples in the images above may look natural, all of them are completely designed, controlled, and maintained. Alejandra Feliciano, botanist and landscape designer, while at Oxford College of Garden Design, developed a succinct presentation in which she describes several planting design models that range from traditional layering to more blended mixes. Claudia West and Thomas Rayner, in their book Planting in a Post-Wild World, explain in detail components of the natural models and push the ideas of plant blending toward the ecological realm. We will start with Alejandra, who is a botanist, landscape designer, and an expert in sustainable seed mixes. I'll be summarizing some of the points and showing some of the images from her presentation. Alejandra categorizes planting design into 5 design models and arranges them on a continuum from the least intermingled to the most intermingled, from blocks to blends. Let's look at the characteristics of each planting model. As we look at each model, take note of the terms used to describe plant placement: foreground, middle ground, background, accent, primary, secondary, scatter, matrix, and more. See if you can keep track of the terms and how they are similar or different depending on each planting model. The monocultural block is a very common planting model, consisting of a single plant species in horizontal layers. It results in consistent and conservative landscapes. The plants are all primary plants because they are typically equal in visual weight. The two photos on the bottom show block planting styles from Portola Springs with 3 broad layers over a large area, and Rancho Mission Viejo with narrow bands against homes. Once the plants have grown in, they are meant to be maintained in a consistent, unchanging manner. Weeds are easy to see, maintenance is straightforward: water, fertilizer, pruning, weed eradication, all on a precise schedule. The mixed border planting model is a little more casual. It uses ovals and elongated bubbles, each of which contain a single plant species. The planting bubbles are typically smaller than blocks, and they tend to include perennials and even annuals as accent plants. Because of the variety, it may be more difficult to spot a weed here or there. Mixed borders are generally viewed from one direction, such as against a building or a wall, and the plants are arranged with smaller in front and taller in back, so that all plants can be seen. Mixed borders are classically part of the English garden model, championed by Gertrude Jekyll. She often grouped her plants by blossom or leaf color according to color theory principles. The terms foreground, middle ground, and background are often used with mixed border plantings. Drifts are elongated blocks or bubbles with soft edges that can intermingle. Multiple species are included within a shape, including perennials and annuals. This wider variety makes weeds harder to isolate, but also less critical to remove unless they begin to dominate the other plants too much. A drift planting is meant to be seen from all directions. It is an effective model to use when designing slope plantings. The intermingling effect results in soft layers and a naturalistic feeling. The drift planting above uses long, narrow bands, each with 3 plant species. The photo in the above middle on the right is a view of those long bands seen from one end. The edges are loose and casual as the plants have filled in. Matrix planting is a variation of drift planting, whereby groups of trees and larger primary shrubs and colorful accent scatter shrubs are set within a backdrop plant matrix. The matrix plants are species that grow between and around the shrubs and fill in the spaces with texture and backdrop color. In this sense, the word backdrop refers to a ground cover as opposed to a vertical backdrop. Typically, the matrix is made with grasses or sedges as a recall of savannas and prairies. The primary shrubs here are the more visually impactful groupings. And the scatter shrubs are the more occasional accents in color and form that are scattered over the planting area. Primary, the scatter, and colorful. One of Alejandra's specialties is composing self-sustaining native plant seed mixes, and her final category on the continuum is called the randomized mixed planting. Is a seed mixed based planting model. Because of this, it is the most randomized, blended, and natural of the planting models, and it is meant to change and evolve as plants succeed one another over time. Using seed mixes can be a very cost-effective method of establishing landscapes, especially on slopes and other large areas. Seed mixes can include annuals, perennials, shrubs, and trees. For a natural and ecologically self-sustaining, habitat-supporting ultimate landscape, one can hardly do better than with a good seed mix consisting of locally collected seed. But it takes many years to establish, and that's usually too long to wait to see the ultimate landscape that can be result. Instead, we usually choose to use container trees, shrubs, and ground covers, sometimes along with a seed mix, in order to more quickly grow a desired landscape. So for a more relevant take on how a natural ecological planting model can be formulated, we look to the authors Rayner and West, who describe a design process with roots in ecological principles. In their book, Planting in a Post-Wild World, Thomas Rayner and Claudia West promote the creation and nurturing of self-sustaining functional plant communities, functioning ecologically as well as aesthetically. This planting model layers plants vertically and not just horizontally so that all ecological niches are filled with the appropriate plants as occurs in nature. As a way to begin, they start by referring to local native landscape types for design interpretation. These references are called landscape archetypes, or goal landscapes. Often this is what we do when we formulate landscape typologies. The photo on the right shows 3 general landscape archetypes: grassland, woodland, and forest. In our region, we often refer to these local native landscape archetypes: oak savanna, coastal sage scrub, oak woodland, oak forest, and sycamore riparian. We take design inspiration from various aspects of these landscapes, and we interpret them in our planting designs in myriad ways, from abstract artistic expressions to efforts at creating self-sustaining habitat for endangered species. With the goal landscape determined, the design process begins with stylization in visual depiction, drawing and sketching, thinking about all the horizontal and vertical plant levels. This means that annuals and perennials are often as important as shrubs and trees in the design of a complete plant community. Layered sketches cover different vertical plant layers in order to depict more complex designs. We will review and practice some easy techniques in Session 3. The authors developed their idea of vertical layering based on the work of botanists and ecologists with great knowledge of plants and their ecological niches. Their 3 sources are Richard Hansen and Frederick Stahl, John Philip Grime, and Norbert Kuhn. Hansen and Stahl, in their book Perennials and Their Garden Habitats, promoted the planting of species in conditions similar to their native habitats. The idea was that you can combine plants from similar habitats, but different regions, and create novel, self-sustaining landscapes. Focusing on perennials, they advocated filling in all niches with appropriate plants in order for the landscape to become self-regulating and therefore easier to maintain. The British ecologist John Philip Grime categorized plants in terms of their behavior in natural settings and how they perform and adapt to environmental conditions. He divided up plants into competitors, the main plants, stress tolerators, plants that thrive under stress, and rudderals. Rudderals are basically volunteers, the first colonators of disturbed areas. Rayner and West criticize his system because plants rarely belong in just one of these 3 categories, and many plants exhibit the characteristics of all 3. German professor Norbert Kuhn combined the strengths of Hansen and Grime's models, that is, plants' preferred habitats, and plants' performance and adaptability to environmental conditions, into one model, and he categorized plants adaptive strategies into 8 categories as a guide to choosing species. The categories are based on plant spread strategies. They are conservative growth, moderate stress adaptation, stress avoidance, area occupation, area coverage, area expansion, niche occupation, and gap occupation. This list seems to go from more shy plants to more aggressive ones. In a later book, he broke down the 8 main categories into several subcategories. In order to use the system, all the plants must be placed in the categories and selected in a logical manner according to a design concept. It is apparent that these 3 systems are very complex planting design models. They require extensive botanical knowledge. After all, they were developed by botanists, and ecologists. Rayner and West try to simplify the categorization process into far fewer. What Rayner and West did was to use the most relevant elements from all 3 systems to come up with their vertical layering approach to plant selection and design. They start with the most visibly noticeable plants and work their way vertically down, filling in 4 main layers: the structural plants layer, the seasonal plants layer, the ground cover plants layers, and the dynamic filler plants layers. The top 2 layers are design layers. They're more visible. The bottom 2 layers are functional layers. They provide less visible ecological support. For example, soil loosening, nitrogen fixing, beneficial insect support, mycorrhizal fungi, ground layer duff, and more. The structural layer includes trees and shrubs, large shrubs, the largest visual elements, the space definers, located in groups or groves. Next is the seasonal layer of mid-sized shrubs and/or perennials that flower or otherwise change during the year. The next layer down is the ground cover layer, which contains low, visually unifying plants and ground-holding plants. And finally, there is the dynamic filler layer, a layer of annual and perennial nurse plants that can fill in bare areas during the time when other plants may be dormant or have declined. This layer can be applied as a seed mix that comes up quickly and helps to fill in areas between growing shrubs, helping them compete with weeds during establishment. Depending on the plants chosen for each category, this system can be easier to use because you only need to fill in 4 categories of plants. Several plant species can belong to each category, but it is important that the plants be pre-qualified according to their suitability to the overall goals of the concept. Each layer is applied in a more or less natural manner, but typically not randomly. Rather, the plants are purposefully located according to many of the same guidelines as more traditional models. Trees are located for shade. Smaller plants tend to occupy border and foreground areas along walks. Larger shrubs placed further back, trying not to block important views or signs. Flowering accents scattered or strategically located in drifts to catch the eye. It is not a random arrangement, but it could be a natural ecological one. Rayner and West call their completed vertical layered planting design model a designed plant community, where all the layers together ensure diverse, complete, functional, successional coverage. The designed plant community occupies the last position in our continuum of planting design models. It is designed in the sense that the plants are consciously placed, and it is a community in that the intent is to function not just aesthetically, but also ecologically. It aspires to become a self-sustaining, habitat-supporting landscape. As a planting model, it is easily within the natural ecological paradigm. That last composite diagram looks somewhat like the planting models of the Great Park neighborhoods, some portion of which approach the objective of a designed plant community. Within the overall neighborhoods, there are several goal landscape typologies: evergreen, deciduous, grassland, and ecotone, each with a pre-qualified plant list. The plants in each category are categorized using the term primary for the foreground smaller plants and the ground cover plants, secondary for medium-sized shrubs and flowering shrubs playing a supporting role, and accents for larger shrubs and small groupings between the trees. The Great Park typologies also allow for an additional wildflower meadow seed mix or a coastal sage scrub seed mix in large open areas reserved for that purpose. But the purposeful vertical layering role of plants is not strictly focused on in the Great Park. Rather, the plants are located more in the spirit of the drift and matrix planting design models using a large portion of native plants. Attempts to create habitat support may become moderately successful if the plants are not over-irrigated during their summer dormancy or otherwise maintained away. But even with the challenges, there are some portions of the Great Park neighborhood landscapes that begin to exhibit the characteristics of a designed plant community by virtue of the amount of native plants that have been thriving. So now we can modify the planting model continuum diagram to include Rayner and West's designed plant community, in place of the seed mix only randomized natural planting model. Also, we can group the planting model functional locational terms with the models with which they go best. For example, the terms foreground, middle ground, and background go well with blocks and mixed borders. The terms primary, secondary, and accent go pretty well with mixed borders and drifts. The terms structural, accent, and matrix go well with drifts and matrix plantings. And the terms structural, seasonal, ground cover, and filler go with matrix plantings as well as designed plant communities. Planting terms like these help communicate where the plants are located in a design. You may notice that whatever the planting model, the functional locational terms, by and large, seem to be describing similar, if not the same, locations. Plants don't need to fit all the terms, and your planting design doesn't need to be one of these models or pictured in one of these boxes. But chances are it already is. Sometimes it helps to know which box you are in so that you can make a conscious effort to go on to the next one, or to jump out of the box entirely. Let's look at the following images on the next two slides from local projects. Which planting models does each best represent? I've noted my impression. Do you agree? The next one. And next one. There we go. Here is a quiz. So the idea here is to mark the planting model or models that best fits the photograph. So the grassy meadow and the perennial garden from New York Botanical Garden uses species of grasses as a unifying matrix or background plant. So this one can be called the matrix planting model. The next one is from the Crystal Cove Ocean Garden. It comprises a single plant species in a range in sort of biomorphic shapes. You can sort of trace your finger around the shapes where each plant is located. So I would call this one a mixed border planting model. The next slide shows the Bee and Bosque Park at part of the Great Park neighborhoods, and it aspires to be a random natural landscape or a designed plant community. It has aspects of both, one could argue. And then the last slide is a front yard from Cypress Village that looks like it could be a drift planting design, but if upon closer inspection, it is actually a block planting design model where the plants have been. And the last slide is a continuation of the quiz. Keukenhof Gardens in Holland, classic block planting design. Single species in single areas with no weeds in sight. Next slide is Crystal Cove Deep Sea Entry. Again, you can sort of trace your finger around the oval shapes, each containing one plant species. And this becomes, this is a mixed border planting design model. Another one at Crystal Cove down at the Rec Center. This one has been allowed to intermingle, but it is really well, it shows a matrix, which is wrong. It's really another mixed border planting design model. I will fix that in the slideshow. And then the Lurie Garden in Chicago by the famous landscape architect Piet Oudolph. And it appears to be a drift planting model. And you can see intermingling areas containing more than one species. But since it's designed by Mr. Oudolph, who knows more about plants than anyone I will ever meet, it is probably also a designed plant community that will succeed and change over time, all by design. Thank you. See you for session 2.